So in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to be doing a project that involves eugenics in Britain between the years of about 1880 and 1950, something like that. And in order to prepare for that project, I'm having to do research. And part of that research involves reading some pamphlets and articles and book material by an English statistician, eugenist, and biometrician, philosopher, academic generally, named Karl Pearson. And Pearson started the first department of statistics in any university in the world. The basic correlation coefficient, Pearson's R, named after him. He worked on principal component analysis. He took over Galton's biometry and eugenics lab. So this is one of the fundamental guys in the history of statistics. Probably smarter and more accomplished than 99% of academics out there, much less normal people. So this is a serious guy, and your basic shit lib or your basic conservative or whatever, you know, they can't dismiss a guy with accomplishments of this caliber. And it's important that they can't dismiss him because he disagrees fundamentally with both of them. Karl Pearson was a materialist. He was a socialist. He was an atheist. He was a nationalist. He was a socialist, yeah. So he was all, and a eugenist. He was all these things, and he left a lot of writings behind and influenced a lot of people, especially up until the end of the Second World War, when the Anglo-American intellectual regime completely changed. The end of World War II brought about really a new world order, especially intellectually, where the developments of these eugenical ideas that had been going since 1860, brought about for the most part by Darwin's Origin of Species. There's just a break. There's a huge break after the end of World War II. Now, the tradition that supplanted it didn't begin with the end of World War II. That stuff started, you know, way before, maybe even as far back as 1890, but certainly it was going strong in the 20s and 30s. So then it supplanted the other tradition and led into the cultural Marxist problems and the deconstruction of basically everything valuable, and that's where we are today. So what I'm finding in doing this research is that there's a lot of keys to what we lost and what we could have had can be found here. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about Pearson, and then I think what I'll probably do is record some readings of some of his material that I find interesting, and then you can, you know, appraise it for its own value. A little bit about Pearson. So he was born in England and brought up there. I think he came from a very well-off family based on his intellectual stuff. He was like a professional student or something, probably up until he was like 35. Went to private schools, went to Germany to be taught at some of the best German universities. This guy was into poetry, he was into metaphysics, he was into philosophy, and then when he was in Germany, he got introduced to socialism. One really important thing that I've had to learn over time that's kind of softened my opinion toward the left, and it's necessary to say not the left as it exists, but the left as it could exist. Let me back up a little bit. To talk about it in terms of Darwin, if you think about all of the possible species of animals that could ever exist, theoretically, you know, there's like an infinite number of species, infinite number of animals that you could imagine or postulate or whatever. A very, very small number of all possible animal species have ever actually existed. Furthermore, most of those species that have come into existence have either died out completely or transformed into something else. Very few species that have ever existed are still recognizable today. So in the same way, there's a lot of political ideologies, a lot of combinations of political thoughts that could exist. Only a certain number of those have come into existence, and only a certain number of those are recognizable. So in the same way, you can imagine this huge constellation of leftist ideology. And the way that I usually think about leftism is that there's two kinds. There's national leftism, and then there's international leftism. National leftism has not really existed in any Western country since the end of the Second World War. I would classify the National Socialist regime in Germany during the 30s and 40s as a leftist, national leftist regime. And that has basically been taboo since then, so you don't see it anywhere. What we've seen instead is the proliferation of, since the Bolshevik Revolution, of international leftism. And that stuff is cancer to civilization. It is, especially Western civilization, it is absolutely cancerous. It kills people, it destroys capital, and it destroys culture and civilization. It's just the worst thing that's ever existed, probably. So, recognizing this and seeing that there is an alternative on the left kind of softened my opinion towards that stuff. Pearson became a socialist in Germany when he was there taking studies from Mommsen and some other famous German guys. And the kind of socialism that he brought back to Britain was decidedly anti-internationalist. He says in one of his works, I think it's called the moral basis for socialism is one of the ones I was reading. He gives two different strands basically of this kind of socialist intellectual ferment. One basically he calls positivism, which is kind of the trend that's coming out of the French Revolution, that says that there is a brotherhood of all men. Humanity is a goal, is an idol, is a god itself, and we have to push humanity and mankind forward. He says that's not really good. What we need to do instead is look, your individual self, you have to look at where you're located historically. That's within a nation, within a polity, and then you have to work for the betterment of that. You can't work for the betterment of all mankind, but you can work for the betterment of your nation and your people. So, okay, that makes sense. In terms of his economics, it's clearly leftist. It seems to be heavily influenced by Henry George, because in his other work, I'm sorry, let me see if I can find the title, just so that I can give you the reference. Yeah, Socialism in Theory and Practice. This is from 1884. In that one, he says that there should be a 100-year license granted on all land and all basically heavy industry or big capital investments like railroads. So the owners of all railroads and all land in the country will get a 100-year license on them. You can continue to profit from it. You can pass it on to your kids or your grandchildren or whoever. If you die, you can sell it and all this kind of stuff. But after 100 years, all of that stuff is going to revert to the government. The government's going to own all of it. And then the government will have the task of trying to equalize the product of labor by basically cutting out the rentier class, cutting out the fat cats, cutting out the speculators, cutting out the people who live on wealth. Everyone will have to work to eat. Everyone will survive on the basis of their labor. And then presumably there'll be a welfare state to take care of the people who can't work. So that is at least a leftism, which it's kind of like the opposite of the universal basic income leftism, and it's squarely targeting the plutocrats. So, it's got problems. That's not my preferred economic system, but I think it is, light years better than what our version of the extant left today promotes, and the internationalist globalist left and Bolshevism and, you know, Talmudic leftism and all that kind of stuff. It's way different than that, and it's much more defensible. So I'll probably do a reading from this article that he and his research assistant or co-author, former research assistant, published in 1925. But Karl Pearson basically gives you a racialist and utilitarian, and might I stress that the combination of those things is very powerful, very, very powerful when you put them together. Argument for either having very low number, or having probably very low numbers of immigrants to your country, but then also controlling where those immigrants come from. And for being from 1925, I mean, these arguments are more advanced and better articulated than a lot of stuff than we get today. So that's what I'm doing right now. That's what I'm up to. Doing research on this guy, doing research on Francis Galton, which was the immediate predecessor to Pearson, and then doing research on Ronald Fisher, who was the successor to Leonard Darwin, and Galton and Pearson basically kind of moved into that spot. And then it all ends. It all ends at that point. It basically completely recedes from public view. It's totally outcast. So I'll keep you posted on that and add some material from this guy, and hopefully it'll be interesting. If you have any comments for me, please let me know. Thank you for your time.